Okay, people, we're going to get started here, even though people are still filing in just a little bit, but we're running a little bit behind schedule. So every time I come to this convention, I'm a little bit bad about getting the topic of my presentation given to the Expo so that they can print it on the materials and on the website and whatnot. So it's always interesting how you guys come in having absolutely no idea what I'm going to talk about, and but you usually like it. So this year we're going to be talking about phone phreaking. Now, I told some people a few days ago that I was going to be talking about phone phreaking in the Portland Retro Gaming Expo, and I was surprised a lot of people didn't even know what that was. In fact, a lot of people thought I was talking about telephone pranking, which is not the same thing. They're entirely different. However, back in the 1980s, before the advent of caller ID, I did probably more than my fair share of telephone pranking. However, that's not actually what we're going to be talking about, although you can use phreaking to accomplish pranking, which we can talk about later. So what is telephone phreaking? That is basically where you hack the telephone system in order to make long-distance calls for free, among other things. And I will preface this by saying it is highly illegal. However, before anybody gets worried about me teaching their kids about doing illegal things, I will preface this entire presentation by saying everything I'm going to be talking about is obsolete, no longer works, it's just being presented for historical purposes. So, phreaking's been around for quite a while, probably not quite that long, but started in like the 1960s, became particularly popular in the 1970s, and talk about how the first method was using a 2600 hertz tone, and I'll explain a little bit about how that works. So this is your typical, well, I wouldn't say typical, but this is a DTMF keypad. Now the original ones actually had these A, B, C, D letters down the side, but most of your consumer telephones never had these, but the operator phones did, as well as the military phones had these, and they had their own set of tones. Now the way a DTMF tone works, for those who don't know, is you basically have particular frequencies across horizontally and then particular frequencies vertically. And so when you push a button, it actually combines these two tones, and that creates the sounds you hear when you push buttons on the phone. Now, a lot of people thought and still think that those buttons on the phone actually directly control the phone system, but they don't. They literally just make sounds. And when I was a kid, I thought, yeah, there must be some kind of direct connection between these buttons and the phone company so they know which button I'm pushing, and that the sounds I heard was just like a byproduct of how they work. But in reality, I had it exactly opposite. The tones is all the phone company cares about, and you can actually generate these tones externally. For example, you could record the DTMF tones to a cassette tape and then hold the cassette player up to your phone, and it would actually dial the phone number, and the phone company doesn't care where the tones come from as long as it hears tones that it recognizes. And so this is kind of important for what we're going to be talking about here in just a minute. So imagine this is your local neighborhood phone company here. Now there's going to be anywhere from dozens, hundreds, maybe thousands of telephone lines going into your local phone exchange. And those phones could be home phones, business phones, pay phones, whatever. Now these phones can call each other without incurring any long distance charges and without even going outside of your local phone company. But if you needed to make a long distance call, well, that's where things changed, and you would go over these other special lines that linked phone exchanges together, and they were called trunk lines. Now, trunk lines don't actually work all that different from a regular telephone line in that they also are controlled by tones, or at least they used to be. And the trunk lines, they had their own dial tone, or their own ready tone, and that tone was a 2600 hertz tone, which is a really high-pitched sound. Not normally the type of sound that you would hear like in nature, so it wouldn't necessarily be a problem. But the offshoot of this is that if you were to place a long-distance phone call, your local exchange would pick up a trunk line and dial a phone number for that trunk line to connect to. And you would not typically have been aware of this. It would happen right after you dialed your number. But if a 2600 hertz tone was introduced during the course of the call, it would cause the trunk line to hang up and go back into ready mode and wait for you to dial the number of where you want to connect to. So the offshoot of this was that if you were to call a 1-800 number, it's a toll-free number, right? Your local exchange says, oh, well, this is a long distance call, so we're going to need to use a trunk line. But it's a toll-free call, so we're not going to bill the customer for this call. So you would call the 1-800 number, and then as soon as it starts ringing, you could play 2600 hertz tone, and the trunk line would hang up and wait for you to now enter a new number because it's back in ready mode again. And then you could call whoever you wanted to, and your local exchange still believes you're talking to a toll-free number, so you didn't get billed for it. Now, one of the in the early 1970s, one of the early pioneers of this method was John Draper, and he went by the code name of Captain Crunch. Now, you might wonder how a person would get a code name like Captain Crunch. It's a little bit more straightforward than you might think. It actually came from this little whistle that was included as a toy in the Captain Crunch cereal box back around 1971 or so. And what Draper figured out was that there's two little ports on the side of that, and if you covered one of them up, it actually produced a 2600 hertz tone, perfect for causing trunk lines to hang up. In fact, one of the interesting offshoots he would talk about was that if you were to walk through an airport, there would be banks of pay phones back then, and people would be on the phones. And of course, you can imagine in an airport, most of those calls are probably long-distance calls, so they're probably using trunk lines. And he could just walk by a bank of payphones and blow his little Captain Crunch whistle, and it would hang up every payphone that people were talking on, and they wouldn't know why. They would think there's something wrong with the phone company. But yeah, you could use that for literally making free telephone calls if you knew how. So that was the 70s. Now, when the computer age came in the 80s, things changed quite a bit. I'm going to play you this little 60-second clip from the movie War Games. Many of you have probably already seen this, but it'll be just a little refresher here. You don't seem to have any audio. Okay, well, that we tested this audio and it was working perfectly earlier. So anyway, he's dialing numbers. Jennifer's asking what he's doing. He's saying he's dialing every number in, I think, Sunnyvale or something like that, and looking for a computer. And she asks, isn't that expensive? And his reply is that there's ways around that. And in the movie, they never really go into any particular detail as to how he's getting around it, and so we really don't know exactly which method he was using. But I want to talk a little bit. There's actually a lot of different things happening in the scene, and I wanted to go ahead and talk about some of that. So first, I want a little refresher on how telephone numbers work, and for most of the guys in this audience that are my age or older, this is going to be old news, but for a lot of the younger kids who've grown up with cell phones, they may not understand how the anatomy of a telephone number works. So I want to start by talking about the first three digits, which is, of course, the area code. And this typically refers to a particular geographical area, typically like a county, something like that. Now, back in my day, we actually didn't even have to dial the area code. We just dialed the 7 digits. And the only reason you would ever dial an area code back then was if you were making a long-distance phone call. So that was one way you always knew whether your call was going to be local or long distance, was whether or not you were dialing the area code. Now, I grew up in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and we had primarily 2 area codes. If you lived in Tarrant County, where I did, we had the area code of 817. And if you lived in Dallas County, then it was 214. Actually, we've got like 10 different area codes in there now, but back in the 80s, this was all we had. And actually, one particularly unfortunate scenario was it was really expensive to call from Fort Worth to Dallas or Dallas to Fort Worth. And I, to this day, do not really understand why that was, because like I want to say that I could call like Dallas and it was like 85 cents a minute or something like that, where I could call Los Angeles and it would be like 11 cents a minute, or New York and it would be like 11 cents a minute or something. But for some bizarre reason, it was like 4 or 5 times more expensive to call between these 2 counties than to make an actual like really long distance call. And if you were really unfortunate and you lived along this dividing line, your next door neighbor could actually be like a really expensive phone call to make, which is really crazy. Anyway, the next 3 digits is the prefix. And again, this had particular significance back in the 80s. The prefix would actually narrow down a very specific geographical area. So back in the 80s, the 473 prefix was the city of Mansfield, which is where I lived. And so you knew if you saw a telephone number that you could actually narrow down, almost like a zip code, you could narrow down a particular geographic area where that telephone number was. And unlike cell phones and stuff today, they can have any number and there's really not any significance to them. But back then, you could tell a lot by looking at a phone number. So if you wanted to be like David on War Games and you wanted to hack into your school computer and change your grade, well, before you could even start to hack the computer, you'd have to find it first. You'd have to, not likely to tell the students what the number was to the modem for the school computer, but you could probably make several assumptions in that the area code and prefix you could probably figure out just by the geographic location of your school. In fact, it would probably be the same as the main office number that would be advertised to call the school. So all you would have to figure out is the line number, which is the last 4 digits. So there's still 10,000 combinations, but how could you narrow that down even more? Well, you could do what they were doing in the movie, which is called war dialing. And so the way that works is you would have your computer and you would tell it probably before you go to bed at night to start calling phone numbers. Now you would go ahead and tell it a specific area code and prefix, and then you just start it off at like 0 or 1, and it would just start calling, probably in the middle of the night, and probably some irritated person is going to wake up in the middle of the night answering a call, and there's not going to be anybody there. And the computer, of course, can't tell who answered the phone, especially back then. They couldn't even detect busy signals or ringtones or operator recordings, or if a human being answered and said hello, they couldn't tell. All they knew is that there was no computer answering. So they would just time out, and then after a moment later, the computer would try again. It would call the next number in the sequence. And again, you'd probably wind up with irritating some other person in the middle of the night. But eventually, after a certain amount of time, you would call a number and another computer would answer. And when this would happen, the computer would mark that number as being significant. It would either print it to your printer, or it would save it to a disk for a file you could look at. So when you get up in the morning after you've woke up half the town, you could look and see there'd probably be about, I know from experience, about 20 about 20 or 30 computers that it would have found. And those could be, one of them is probably your school computer. They could be banks or any number of things back in the time, and you could attempt to hack into them. But, at least you've narrowed it down now to 20 or 30 different phone numbers. So that will give you a head start. But let's talk about the second part about that, which is how do you do it for free? Now, we already talked about one way, which was using a blue box. Now, that was using... when they call them a blue box, it's because back then they actually had to construct a box back in the 70s to do this kind of stuff. And there were all these different kinds of boxes that do different things. Now, when the computer age came around, we ended up doing a lot of these things with our personal computers, so we didn't really need a box, but we still called it blue boxing or black boxing or red boxing or whatever. And I'm not going to go through all these because it would take like 2 hours. I'm just going to briefly tell you what some of these different ones did. The blue box we already talked about, which was the 2600 hertz tone on an 800 number. The black box actually kind of does the exact opposite. You modify your own phone line so that when somebody calls you long distance, it would trick the phone company into thinking that you haven't actually answered your phone yet. It would, the phone company on the other end would actually think that your phone was still ringing, so they wouldn't actually charge the person calling you, but you would actually be able to answer and talk to them. Didn't always work. It only worked in certain geographical areas, but that was called a black box. The red box, this was used for payphones. So just like trunk lines and regular phones, payphones made very specific tones that they sent to the phone company to tell them how many quarters, dimes, or nickels that you've inserted. And so you could actually take a red box and take it to a payphone and just hold it up to the microphone and, push the button, and it would create the sounds for quarters. And the phone company would think you've inserted quarters. You could put $10 worth of quarters in there, for example, and then make whatever call you wanted to wherever. You had to be a little bit careful, though, not to put, I think there was a certain number. I want to say it was like $200. Like if you ever put more than $200 of fake quarters into a payphone, they would immediately send the police to investigate because the phones actually couldn't hold more than that amount of money. And so they had like a flag that says, hey, if any phone ever says you've inserted like $300, send the police immediately to investigate that payphone. So you had to be a little bit careful how much money you told that you were putting in there. The silver box adds the ABCD functions that the operators had, which you could do multiple different things with that. And military phone lines also had the ABCD buttons, and there's a lot of information that could be talked about there, but that would be a whole separate discussion. Oh, and then there's the blotto box. Has anybody ever heard of a blotto box? I see a few hands. Yeah, you know how you always say, oh, we used to sit around campfires and talk about this or that. Well, you know, us hackers, when we were 12, we'd sit around campfires and talk about building blotto boxes. And we seriously believed this actually existed, although we found out later it was just a hoax. It was mythical, didn't really exist. But the idea was you would take like a Honda generator or Tesla coil or something like that and hook it up to your phone line, and it would paralyze the entire city's phone. All the phones would ring constantly, and nobody would be able to place or receive any calls. And we thought that would be like the pinnacle of hacking to do that. But it actually, you know, knowing what I know about electronics today, you can immediately know this would never work, because those little copper wires, I mean, how much amperage could you possibly put down them before they'd melt? I mean, come on. But yeah, we believed this back in the time. It was quite a fable. So I'm going to talk about another way of getting free phone calls, and that was by using these calling cards. Now, the way these worked, these are ancient history as well, but they looked very much like a credit card, and they would have a code, access code, printed on the front. And what you would do is, if you had one of these cards, you would call a local number or a 1-800 number, and then a little recording would come on saying, please enter your access code. And you would type in the code on the card, and then you would get another dial tone, and then you would type in the long distance number you wanted to call. Now the purpose behind this was actually a lot for like traveling businessmen, for example, because if you needed to place your long distance business calls, you could do it from a payphone, you could do it from a relative's house, you could do it from a hotel room, wherever you happen to be, and you would make sure the calls got billed to your company's long distance card instead of, you know, wherever you happen to be. But all you had to do was find some access codes if you wanted to hack these. So how would you do that? It would actually be surprisingly similar to war dialing. You could set up your computer to call whatever access code or whatever the phone number was for the long distance company, and then it would dial a random access code, and then you would need to give the computer a known good modem number. And it didn't matter what it was, as long as it was a known good phone number that was guaranteed to be answered by a modem. It could be a BBS, it could be your school's computer, it could be whatever, as long as a modem would answer that line. And so what the computer would do this entire sequence, and it would call that, and then most likely it would time out because the code probably doesn't work. And so it would just repeat the same thing again, and it would use another random number for the code, and probably still wouldn't work. But eventually, another computer would answer the other line. And what this would tell the program you were using is, bingo, that code worked. And it would save that code, either print it to your printer or save it to your floppy disk. And you would do this before going to bed at night, and at least you don't wake up half the town doing it. But you get up the next morning, and bam, you've got like 5 or 6 long-distance codes available. And you would use those codes throughout the day. Now, what you would do is you would do this every night, because you wouldn't want to really use the same code over and over again, because then you'd probably get caught, because they'd be like, well, this code's being abused all the time, and it's coming from the same house. So you just want to use new codes every day, and that would keep the phone companies guessing as to what was going on there. So that was another way of phreaking that didn't involve any particularly special hardware. And I'll come back to this in a minute. Let's see, how are we doing on time? Okay, we're just right on time. I'm going to have to put the microphone in the stand, and then I'm going to show you a little program. Did we ever get the sound fixed? Because we're going to need the sound for some of them. Actually, I think I know what may be going on here. Hope I got time to fix this. Okay, yeah, it's trying to send that out the HDMI port. What about now? Let me play my war games again, see what that sound. Aha. Okay, yeah, we changed adapters right at the end and made the laptop switch to, okay. So this, let's see if we can go full screen here. There we go. Okay. So this is a little program that a lot of us Commodore guys used back in the day. And this is just an emulation, of course, so I'm not going to be able to completely demonstrate this, but I think you'll definitely get the idea of how it worked. So this is called Teleclone. It was made by Sergeant Pepper. This is one of the later versions. He made it all throughout the 1980s. And this program actually does a lot of different things. And I'm not even going to begin to show them all, but I wanted to show a few of them. So I'm going to go to the phone and freak box mode. And you'll notice there's all these different colors of boxes in here that do all kinds of different things. So I'm going to show you the blue box. This is one we talked about at the very beginning where we did the 1-800 number and then the 2600 hertz tone on the trunk line. And so you could do this all from your computer. So do you need the 2600 hertz tone? Yes. We don't need the pink noise. But this would be like the phone number, like the long distance number you actually wanted to call. So you could put in like 214 and then, whatever. Then you would want a 1-800 number. It doesn't matter what the number is as long as it's a valid number. Actually, interesting, this is the default number that the program includes. I actually looked this up the other day. This was, I think, the customer service number to GTE, which is kind of ironic. I actually tried calling it a few days ago to see what it was, and it's actually some scam company now. So, I don't remember what it was, like auto warranty scams or something like that. But anyway, yeah. So, at this point, it's ready to go. Now, you actually don't even need a modem to use this program. What you could actually do is take the handset for your telephone and hold it up to your monitor or television screen or whatever right next to the speaker. And it would dial the number, and then it would wait. As soon as you hear it ringing, you would press enter. There's your tone. And now I've got a free telephone call to wherever it is that I wanted. It was that easy. And I literally just holding it up to the monitor and then bring it right to I didn't even have to touch the phone to do it. And that's how easy it became to do this in the computer age when we had these things. And it became quite popular. And it's obvious why the phone company eventually had to change the way everything worked so that these things didn't work anymore. So let me show you a couple other little things. So here's the red box. So now you probably couldn't use this, computers weren't terribly portable at the time, but what you would probably do is just record these tones like onto a cassette tape. And so here's the quarter tone, the dime, or nickel. And yeah, you could just record those like onto a cassette tape and then just go to like a payphone and then hold it up and you've got free calling on your payphone. So now I want to show you, go back to box menu, the cracker box. So here's how this works. This is for those long distance calling cards that I was talking about. So you would type in the phone number to whatever the long distance company was, and then you would say whether you want random or sequential numbers. Doesn't really matter, I'll just say random numbers. You could set a particular time interval between the calls. And then you would tell it how many digits the particular long-distance company card, like the calling card, how many digits they use for their access code. So let's just say 6 digits. You could type in a code to, like whatever you wanted to start with. And then this would be the number you would expect a modem to answer so it could test the code with. So this would be any number that you would expect a modem to answer. And then you want to know, do you want to put your codes to a printer or a disk? So you just say printer if you want to just print them out as it finds them. And if everything looks correct, then you go yes, and then you go to bed, and it starts its thing. And it would, of course, we're not going to be able to see anything on here. It's an emulator. But yeah, in the morning you'd wake up, and it'd show you on the screen number of good codes found, and be like 5 or 6, and they'd be ready there waiting for you. So that's how that worked. So the next thing I was going to talk about is why people did it. And there's actually more reasons than you might think. Sergeant Pepper and people like Steve Wozniak have talked about this, and a lot of the reason they did it was not necessarily because they wanted to cheat the phone company, but simply because it was challenging. It was hacking. It was fun. It was a way of trying to challenge themselves to see what they could figure out next. And like Steve Wozniak said, for example, this is back before he was wealthy, right? He said that he did it for the fun of it, but when he called his own personal family and friends, that he always paid for the calls. He only did phreaking when he was simply trying to figure out how stuff worked. And he said once he figured it all out, he got bored of it and didn't do it anymore. But that's one element. But in the 80s particularly, a lot of us teenagers did it because it was our only way of transferring files on computers with our friends. Because back then, long-distance calls were extremely expensive. So if you, for example, even if I wanted to transfer a file to a friend who lived in Dallas, which is only like a 30-minute drive, it would be, well, just to do the math, back then, I mean, just one disk used to take like 5 or 6 hours to transfer over a modem. So if you multiply that by like 89 cents a minute, that was a heck of a lot of money you'd have to pay. It'd be much cheaper just to mail it to them or get in a car and drive over there. But particularly if they lived in Germany or Australia or the UK or something like that, it could be insanely expensive. And so the way we looked at it is it was, especially we were teenagers, we were broke, we didn't have jobs. It was kind of like piracy. It's, you know, the way we kind of tended to think of piracy back then was, you know, we copied games from each other because we couldn't afford them. Some people could, but most of us teenagers were broke. And so you would say, oh, well, you're cheating the game companies, the publishers that made the games. And, well, there's a certain amount of truth to that. But one way of looking at it is that we wouldn't have had the games regardless. I mean, like, if we had to buy them, we just wouldn't have had them. So the game company still wouldn't have gotten any money from us because we were broke. But so, I mean, we looked at it from a standpoint of, I'm going to copy this game because that's literally the only way I can get it. And so we looked at telephone phreaking kind of the same way. We're going to do the phreaking because it was the only way we could make these long-distance phone calls. Because, yeah, if our parents found out that we were, you know, calling and charging, you know, hundreds of dollars to our phone bill, that wouldn't last very long. So that's two of the main reasons why phreaking was done. And we are exactly on time at 4:30. So I guess I'm ready for questions. All right, I'll start with you.
So, David, in regards to phreaking, one of the things that came to mind was 80s, 90s movies, the parents are at home, the phone rings, and it's a loved one who's a fugitive on the run, and the police are there and they're tracking the phone number. And they're telling the parents, keep him on the line. We almost got him. Is that real in any way, or is that just a load of barnacles?
I think there's a certain amount of truth to that because they could track numbers back then, and it did take time. Yeah. No, I actually don't. Sorry. Any other questions? Yeah.
I've heard that area codes were allocated based on having lower numbers for higher volume areas. Like Los Angeles is a very low area code number, whereas a place further afield might have a 999. Dialing rotary phones took a long time to do that. Do you know anything about how those were allocated?
Well, that's an interesting question. I do know that area codes always had to have a 1 or a 0 as their middle number because it's 3 digits, and so I don't think there would be a 999 area code back then. But yeah, you're right because I've actually heard something about that because yeah, when you dial on a rotary, it used to take forever for the 0 or the 9 because there was so many click, 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 click. But yeah, I don't really know 100% on that. If there was actually any thinking behind that. Yeah, sorry. Yes, sir, what you got?
Yeah, I did a lot of work out when I was a kid, just like you. And I did get some good numbers one time in the movie theater, and I could control their feedback systems. I would like bring the temperature down really low and go in and see what that worked. Did you ever actually find anything like that? Did you ever?
I found numerous, like I said, I know I found a bank, and I found what I think was my school, and I found several other things, but the problem was typically they'd just be like, you'd call and connect to it, and there'd be like one little line telling you something about what you've connected to, and then, you know, username, password, and then I would never be able to get beyond that because I wasn't persistent enough with that. But yeah, I mean, I did find several things, but nothing I was ever able to do anything with. All right, yeah, what you got there in the front?
Do you know how the phone companies ever detected these or prevented them? It sounds like it would be pretty hard to change their infrastructure to not work with these devices.
Yeah, I know how some of it was done. Like with the trunk lines we were talking about with the 2600 hertz ready tone, one of the things that they did in the, I think in the early 80s, was they moved the control. They basically, instead of tones controlling the trunk lines, they moved it to where there was a separate control line as a separate trunk line that carried control information for all the other trunk lines, so that there was no way that the end user could affect what the trunk lines were doing. So that's one of the changes they made, for example. I don't know how they fix some of the other issues, but yeah, they pretty much nullified all of these all of these things. So there was somebody that had their hand up way back there a minute ago. Yeah, yeah.
Not a question per se, but I did the math, and it would have cost me $320.40.
And that's in 1980s money, so that'd be like, $600 or $700 a day. Yes, sir. What you get over there?
You know when they mitigated most of this stuff?
By the mid 1980s, like 1985 or so, I would say half the country had probably already changed over to systems that this didn't work, and by the late 80s, most of it was long gone. Yeah, what you got right there?
What were the tolerances on the tone, i.e. if you get like 2601 or 2605 hertz? Like, do you happen to know how wide the gap?
I don't know for sure, but I did, and many times experiment with recording to tape recorders, and those are not 100% perfect because the speed of the motor is not always exactly right. And so there's got to be a little bit of a tolerance there. I'm not sure exactly how much it is, though.
I imagine there would, because the DTMF tones might be different in one phone than in the other.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, because the oscillators in the phones might be running at slightly different speeds. So, yeah. Mhm. I heard something about a cassette. Well,
Did you ever have a Sony recording not work or something when you know it should have?
no. In fact, one of the things I've done, I used to do that I thought was fun when I was a kid, is I would even record them off TV. Like if people dialed numbers on the TV, I could record it and then play it back over the phone, and it would dial it. It usually wasn't a good number, but it was still fun. Yes, sir.
Do you know anything about the functionality of the extra 4 buttons you showed, the ABCD? Like, what were those used for?
Well, so the operators use those for certain features, and I'll be honest, I've Googled it, and I'm not been able to. I probably just haven't looked hard enough, but I haven't been able to figure out. And I know they were primarily also used in military, because the military had like their own special phone lines, and those were used for something. And yeah, I'm sorry, I wish I could tell you more, but I think they were originally planned to be on all phones, and then I think like right around the time touch-tone phones came out, they decided, no, let's just make it the 1 through 0 with the asterisk and pound. Any other questions? Yeah, over there.
Speaking of Googling, this all happened before the internet as we really know it. How was this information about these programs and stuff disseminated?
So a lot of it was word of mouth, but also bulletin board systems is where, we had online forums, I'd call them. I mean, they're very different from what you would think of today, because you would get on there and because most of these BBSs only had one line, so it would be busy if somebody was using it. But you would call in, you would write a message in the message forum, and then you would hang up, and then the next person would call in, check the forum, and see the message. And so it took a lot longer to disseminate this information, but it still worked. It was pretty effective for for hackers. Yes, sir.
Yeah, you can still do this today with like call boxes or doors when the person on the line is supposed to push 9 to let you in.
Oh,
Play the sound for 9 yourself into the microphone.
yeah. Yeah, that's true, because they're based on pretty antiquated technology. Yeah. I think there was somebody with a hand up over here. Yes.
Okay. So, a while back, my father got a toll-free number so that I could call him from anywhere, and that ended up making it so that he was billed whenever I called him on that number.
Right.
So, if you called the toll-free number and then cut the trunk line, would the toll-free provider be then billed for your call that you were piggybacking on that call?
That's an excellent question, and I was wondering that too, and I wanted to include that in the presentation, but I read several different articles that were contradictory on that fact. Some were saying, yes, they were billed and they would know and see it on their bill, and some articles said, no, they wouldn't even be aware of it, and it would not have been billed. So I don't honestly know the answer to that, because apparently there's some controversy over that. Maybe it varied from one telephone exchange to the next. Maybe that's why there's, yeah. Yes, sir.
The thing that made this not work was the emergency 911 system, the digital system
Yeah.
where they can tell where you live when you call.
Right.
That's about the point. Until they put that in, and in some places that was late 80s and even early 90s, this stuff worked.
Yeah. Yeah, what he was saying is when they introduced the 911 system, there was a lot of changes to the phone companies so that they could track where calls were coming from. And so that affected a lot of things other than just 911 calls. So it made it much more difficult to get away with phone fraud. Where are we at? We got a few more minutes left. Any other questions? Yes. I think some of them did get caught. I don't know exactly what kind of sentences they got. There was definitely, that's actually something that we talked about. I think in the War Games movie, well, we didn't get to hear all the speech because the sound wasn't working, but Jennifer says, "You could go to jail for that." And David replies, "Only if you're over 18. And that was actually kind of the motto that we as kids, because most of us that I knew at the time, we were all like 12, 13 years old when we were doing this, and so we kind of figured we were a little bit immune to it. And I don't know if it came from that movie or if that was just the general line of thinking, was that because we were under 18, we probably wouldn't go to jail. But yeah, I never knew anybody who did. I never knew anybody who went to jail for piracy either. So I think that it was pretty difficult to get caught. I think you had to be doing some pretty extravagant things to get caught. Who did? Oh, he did? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, we got time for just a few more questions. Is anybody else? Oh, I think I see some hands way back there in the back.
Yeah, my best friend and I, we were taught perfect pitch when we were very, very young, like 1, 2, 3 years old. We both play piano now, but we got to the point where we only had to dial 7 numbers way back then. And we were able to call each other's houses just using our voices, but also probably help it out, our voices didn't change it so they were much higher. But in your social circles or hacker groups or whatever back then, did you ever hear of anybody else being able to do anything with the touchtone system using just a voice?
Well, we talked about it. What he's asking about is if you could generate the touch tones with your voice, but because there's 2 different frequencies involved in a DTMF tone, you would need 2 people, I would think, in theory, so we never actually tried it. But yeah, I always figured if you had 2 people and one could generate the horizontal frequency and the other could do the vertical, you could dial a phone with your voice. But yeah, okay. Right, okay. So yeah, they were both doing it. So yeah, I actually have always wondered about that. I've never actually heard if anybody was ever able to do it. So I guess that answers that. And yeah, you've had your hand in the way back there for a while. Video game soundtrack. I don't know, Planet X3? I don't know. Alrighty, let's see what we got. We got about 3 more minutes here. Yes. The Commander 16 is going amazing. As many of you come to my booth over the last couple of days have asked me about that, and I actually wished I could have brought it, but I just didn't have the room in the luggage. And so, yeah, there's been a lot of progress. For those who have been following the Facebook group, the emulator is been downloaded tons, and there's like 14,000 people in the Facebook group, and there have already been many people written fully functional games in assembly language. Somebody just ported Omega Race a couple of days ago, which I was just blown away by, and the hardware isn't even being distributed yet. But our prototypes are working. We've got 4 prototypes now. One of them is actually working at the 8.33 megahertz that we wanted it to be, and it's got a Yamaha YM2151 chip, and it's coming along. There'll be another update soon. And by the way, I will be here, probably more today and definitely tomorrow at my booth, so if anybody has any questions, y'all can come see me. And I do have copies of Planet X2 and X3, as well as a few t-shirts left if anybody wants them. But I think they're going to have me sign autographs out here, which is kind of weird since I do that all day over at the other booth anyway. But I don't have any of the games over there, so if y'all want those, you'll have to come find me at the booth afterwards. What's that? I have no idea.
Yeah. Right behind the merch if you want what was merch.
Yeah. So, alrighty, well, I guess that will conclude this. So I thank everybody for coming.